Performative contradiction. Performative contradiction in 1981, in Frankfurt, Jürgen Habermas published Theorie des kommunikativen Handelns, the theory of communicative action. The book is 2 volumes and roughly 2,000 pages, and its central polemical target is the strain of late 20th century French philosophy associated with Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida, the strain we now loosely call postmodernism. Habermas's principal charge against Foucault is a single-sentence accusation that he repeats in different formulations throughout the work. Foucault commits a performative contradiction. Foucault's position, schematically, is that what we call reason is a configuration of power, that knowledge claims function as instruments of domination, that the structures we recognize as truth are historically contingent arrangements of force. Habermas's reply is short. This position is itself an argument. It is offered for our assent. It asks us to recognize that it is correct and to update our beliefs accordingly. If reason is only power, then Foucault's argument is only power, and we have no rational ground to accept it. If we have a rational ground to accept it, then reason is not only power, and Foucault's claim is false. The argument refutes itself in the act of being made. This is performative contradiction. It is the 7th move in our offensive arsenal, and it is one of the cleanest moves available in serious intellectual combat. The principle is brief. An argument refutes itself when the act of stating the argument violates the content of the argument. The asserter's act and the asserter's content must be consistent. When they are not, when the speaking of the claim is itself a counterexample. To the claim, the position has failed without external refutation. It has refuted itself by being asserted. The opponent does not have to provide any data, any counterexample, any rival theory. They have only to point at the act of assertion and ask, "What are you doing right now?" The class of statements vulnerable to performative contradiction is large and important. I cannot speak spoken. There is no truth claimed as true. All language is socially constructed, including that sentence. We should be skeptical of all claims, including the claim that we should be skeptical of all claims. Reason is only a tool of power said by someone reasoning. No statement is meaningful unless it can be empirically verified. Try to empirically verify that statement. History has no patterns said by someone identifying the pattern of pattern denial in history. In each case, the position is self-undermining in a particular way. The position is not refuted by any external evidence. The position is not refuted by any rival theory. The position is refuted by the bare fact that it has been stated by someone to someone in the expectation of being understood and assented to. The act of stating it presupposes conditions, meaningful language, rational assent, communicable truth, which the content of the stating denies. The asserter, in asserting, uses what they deny. The audience, when the contradiction is named, sees it instantly. They feel the recall. The position they had been considering as a candidate for assent suddenly cannot be a candidate, because to assent to it would be to deny the conditions of their own assent. They cannot occupy the position. The position has no inhabitants. A move which makes a position uninhabitable without any external refutation is a move worth knowing. Wittgenstein, in 1921, ended the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus with one of the most famous passages in 20th century philosophy. My propositions serve as elucidations in the following way. Anyone who understands me eventually recognizes them as nonsensical when he has used them as steps to climb up beyond them. He must, so to speak, throw away the ladder. After he has climbed up it, he must transcend these propositions, and then he will see the world aright. What we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence. The Tractatus has been, for 75 pages, a tightly numbered cascade of philosophical propositions. Wittgenstein has been speaking with great precision about logic, language, and the limits of what can be said. And then, on the last page, he tells the reader that the propositions are nonsensical, that they have been a ladder for the reader to climb, after which the ladder must be discarded, and that what cannot be spoken must be passed over in silence. The whole book has been performatively contradictory by design. Wittgenstein has been speaking at length about precisely what he claims at the end cannot be spoken about. The contradiction is not a flaw in the work. The contradiction is the work. Wittgenstein is teaching by demonstration that certain philosophical claims have a property. When you try to state them, the stating refutes the stated. The logical structure of language is one such claim. The boundaries of meaningful speech is another. To say where the boundary is to step outside it. The book teaches this by performing it. The serious reader of the Tractatus, having climbed the ladder, recognizes something Wittgenstein cannot tell them, and which would be a contradiction for him to tell them about the nature of philosophical speech. The whole book is a code engineered for that recognition. We will return, in Part IV, to philosophical positions whose stating is part of their teaching. For our purposes here, the Tractatus is the most rigorous and beautiful demonstration in modern philosophy that some positions cannot be inhabited from inside the act of their assertion. The performative contradiction, used skillfully, is a move that locates such positions in the wild and exposes them. Shankara, in approximately the year 800 of the Common Era, applied the move with surgical precision against the Buddhist doctrine of anatta, no self. The doctrine, as it had developed in certain Buddhist schools, held that there is no continuous self underlying experience. What we call I is a sequence of momentary mental events, bundled together by habit and language, but lacking any abiding substance. The doctrine was central to Buddhist soteriology. Liberation on this view consisted partly in the recognition that the self one had been clinging to was a fiction, and that clinging to a fiction was the source of suffering. Shankara had philosophical reasons to disagree with this doctrine, and he developed those reasons at length in the Brahma Sutra Bhashya. But before he reached his philosophical reasons, he ran the doctrine through a performative contradiction. He asked, "Who is making this argument?" The doctrine of anatta is being defended by a particular Buddhist philosopher in a particular conversation against particular opponents over a sustained interval of time. The defender produces premises in one moment, draws inferences in subsequent moments, recalls earlier portions of the argument when later portions require them, recognizes objections from yesterday and answers them today. The doctrine, as a doctrine, is something that can be remembered, taught, defended, propagated. It is something the defender holds across time and against opposition. But the defender, by the doctrine, is a sequence of momentary mental events with no continuous self. There is no enduring Atman to remember the premises, draw the inferences, recognize the objections, hold the position. Each moment of the defender's defense is, by the doctrine, a different defender. None of these momentary defenders has access to the others. The premises stated in one moment cannot be related to the conclusion drawn in another, because no enduring entity bridges the moments. The doctrine, applied to its own conditions of being argued, dissolves the argumentative situation. The Buddhist defender of anatta, in the act of defending anatta, presupposes the very continuous self that anatta denies. The defender remembers their own earlier premises, presupposing memory across time, recognizes the opponent as the same opponent over the course of the debate, presupposing the opponent has continuity, which the doctrine also denies, and expects the doctrine itself to remain identical from one moment of articulation to the next, presupposing doctrines have continuity. The act of defending the doctrine performatively contradicts the content of the doctrine. The Buddhist Anattavadin must either revise the doctrine to permit the kind of continuity the defending presupposes, or stop defending the doctrine altogether. The defender, on the doctrine's own terms, cannot consistently defend the doctrine. This is performative contradiction at its most precise. Shankara is not introducing a competing metaphysics. He is not saying the Atman exists because of any positive evidence. He is saying that the very act of arguing for anatta is unintelligible without the Atman. The opponent's position is uninhabited from inside. The Buddhist response over the next several centuries was sophisticated. Some schools refined anatta to a position that did not require the radical no-continuity reading. Others bit the bullet and tried to construct theories of pseudo-continuity that could carry the load of memory and argumentation without an Atman. Some of those refinements survived Shankara's critique, and some did not. The history is intricate. The point is the move. The move can be applied to any position which, in the act of being asserted, presupposes what it denies. The contemporary parallel is everywhere visible once you know to look for it. We will take one example, near to us in time, that is precise enough to be diagnostic. In May and June of 2017, the Evergreen State College in Washington was the scene of a sustained protest. Students at the college had organized what they called a day of absence, a tradition in which students of color left campus for a day in symbolic withdrawal of their participation. In 2017, the organizers reversed the polarity. White students and faculty were asked to leave campus for the day. A biology professor, Brett Weinstein, sent an email to faculty objecting to the reversal. He argued that the original day of absence was a voluntary withdrawal of presence with a specific symbolic content. The reversed version was a request that some people leave a public space on the basis of their race. He distinguished the two acts and said the second was racial discrimination, even if the politics were progressive. The protest against Weinstein went viral. Students gathered outside his classroom demanding his resignation. The college administration negotiated with the protesters. The administration declined to support Weinstein. Eventually, he and his wife, also a biology professor at the college, left. The episode became one of the more widely studied campus protests of its decade, partly because so much of it was on tape. At the center of the dispute is a performative contradiction. The protesters held that racial discrimination was wrong. Their action was a demand that members of one racial group leave a public space. The protesters held that their movement opposed racial categorization as a determinant of where people belonged. The demand sorted people into where they belonged on the basis of racial categorization. The protesters held that their goal was inclusion. The action was exclusion of named individuals based on a racial criterion. This is not a charge of bad motives. The protesters had reasons, in their own framework, for what they were doing. The point is structural. The action they performed is a counterexample to the principle they invoked. The principle says one thing, the action says another. Both are coming from the same actors in the same episode simultaneously. When the contradiction is named, the protester has three available moves. First, revise the principle. Now the principle becomes racial discrimination by the dominant group is wrong, but racial discrimination by other groups is permitted in some circumstances. A more defensible position, but a different one, and one that loses the moral force of the original general principle. Second, revise the action, concede that the demand was inconsistent with the principle, and withdraw it. Third, deny the contradiction by claiming the two cases are not parallel, which requires articulating the disanalogy in a way that does not collapse on inspection. All three are available. None of them is the rhetoric the protesters used at the time, which was to assert the principle and the action together and treat anyone who noticed the contradiction as an opponent. The episode is a textbook performative contradiction, not because the protesters were ill-intentioned. They may or may not have been. That is not what is being assessed here, but because the structure of the dispute had a particular feature. The act being defended was a counterexample to the principle being invoked. This is the situation in which performative contradiction is the right move to make. It is the situation our opponents will sometimes occupy. We have to be able to recognize it and name it. A note on what performative contradiction is not. Performative contradiction is not the move where you find any inconsistency between an opponent's stated views and their behavior and declare them refuted. You said money does not buy happiness, but you bought a coffee, gotcha. That is not the move. The opponent's purchase of coffee is not in tension with the position that money does not buy happiness. It is a small consumer transaction, not a claim about the structure of well-being. The performative contradiction must be tight. The act of asserting the position, considered as such, must violate the content of the position. Loose inconsistencies between general views and particular behaviors are not performative contradictions. They are something else, less powerful and often unjust to the opponent. Performative contradiction is also not the move where you find any self-reference and shout paradox. Self-reference is not the same as self-defeat. The sentence, "This sentence has 5 words," is self-referential and false. The sentence, "This sentence has 5 words," is also self-referential and true. Self-reference can produce paradox, but most self-reference does not. Performative contradiction requires that the self-reference be of a specific kind. The asserting destroys the assertability. When you see what looks like performative contradiction deployed without these properties, you are usually looking at a rhetorical attack rather than a logical move. The audience can sometimes be persuaded by the rhetorical version in the moment. It does not survive examination. We are training for the version that does.